how are you?
Oh, fine, thank you, sir. What was that?
I'm in the mood for love, simply because you're near me.
In the golden age of primetime television, the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour arrived with charm, wit, and a sharp edge hiding beneath its polished surface. CBS had expected a safe, crowd-pleasing variety show, something to compete with Bonanza, not challenge America's conscience. But as the cultural tide of the 1960s surged, the show transformed into a lightning rod of satire, rebellion, and raw commentary. Tension behind the scenes grew thicker with every punchline that hit too close to power. And then, without warning, it happened. A moment on tape that never aired, a decision made behind closed doors, and a show erased from the schedule. The moment didn't just end a show, it exposed the limits of free speech in mainstream media. And it all started with one scene too bold to be seen. The rise of the Smothers Brothers. When the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour debuted in 1967, it was a strategic counter-programming move by CBS to reclaim Sunday night viewers from NBC's Bonanza, a long dominant Western drama. CBS's programming at the time favored tradition. Shows like The Beverly Hillbillies and The Ed Sullivan Show catered to a conservative post-war American audience. Tom and Dick Smothers, known for their clean-cut musical comedy act, seemed like a safe bet to modernize the variety format without alienating mainstream viewers. Network executives viewed the brothers as entertainers who could deliver laughs without stirring controversy. The initial episodes delivered just that: light comedy, musical numbers, and the brothers' signature sibling banter. The show conformed to CBS's expectations of family-friendly television, and early feedback was positive. It gained traction with a broad viewership and met the network's goals in terms of ratings and content tone. But unlike many other variety programs, the Smothers Brothers had creative control written into their contract, a rare allowance that gave them more freedom than most performers on network television. This clause would later prove pivotal in how the show evolved beyond its original concept. Where CBS envisioned it as a ratings phenomenon, Tom and Dick made the show a creative space waiting to be fully explored. They hired a younger, more progressive writing team. Such voices spoke with the increasingly tumultuous social seas of late 1960s life. Their very influence was saying early stylings, which transformed the energy level of the show before any explicit signs of political content were available. The show began moving away from its vaudevillian skits to more substantial, sharper, blended approaches to topical issues with ingenuity. These early structural and stylistic innovations developed into what later became a highly charged program. But at this stage, transformation was technical and tonal, rather than outright ideological. By mid-1967, the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour was beginning to draw a different type of audience. Young viewers hungry for material relevant to the generation's culture clashes. In fact, the show's increasing popularity on college campuses and among youth culture starkly highlighted a very important turning point in network understandings of audience segments. Although taking a while to realize it, CBS was beginning to see the show as more than a time filler. It was slowly transforming into a generational redefining of television. The rise wasn't simply a rating story, it signified an evolution of the medium itself, from being passive entertainment to becoming an active reflection of a society in flux. But behind the scenes, one brother was quietly rewriting the rules of what this show, and television itself, could be. Tom Smothers' quiet transformation. While CBS focused on securing Sunday night viewership, Tom Smothers was engineering a quiet revolution behind the curtain of a variety show. As a product of the 1960s counterculture, Tom was increasingly compelled to use the platform not just for entertainment, but for reflection and resistance. Instead of confronting CBS head-on, he opted for a subtler approach, embedding political and social commentary in ways that initially escaped the network's scrutiny. Comedy sketches took on double meanings, folk songs served as allegories, and satire replaced slapstick. It was a deliberate, calculated evolution that began at the edges before it reached the center. Unlike typical television activism, Tom's transformation was not declarative, but strategic. He pushed against the network's guardrails not with defiance, but with timing and subtlety. For example, while CBS expected the inclusion of mainstream musical guests, Tom booked figures like Pete Seeger and Joan Baez, artists known for their anti-establishment views. Their presence, while defensible on artistic grounds, introduced political undercurrents that reshaped the viewer's experience. Tom framed these choices as entertainment, not protest, allowing him to retain control while advancing a deeper message. It wasn't just what was being said, it was how and when it was delivered. The comedic voice of the show matured over time. Tom brought in a new generation of writers, like Steve Martin and Rob Reiner, who were steeped in satirical culture and had a healthy degree of skepticism toward authority. From one-liners, the material had evolved into parables, from gags into commentaries. The sketches began as mere mimicry of press conferences, political advertising, and religious sermons for the sake of laughter as mirrors of the American power structures. Tom seldom used his screen time to frame ideas instead of dominating them. This direct contact and behind-the-scenes working represented his quiet transformation, really, his shaping of the show not as a star, but along with strategies. This shaping eventually would alter the whole relationship that television had with politics. Tom's gradual infusion of commentary paved the way for the show's more overtly political segments later on, such as Pat Paulson's campaign satire and David Steinberg's short sermonettes. His achievements weren't even just about what he said, though. They also had to do with proving that comedy could wage tactical assaults, challenging, educating, and provoking within the confines of primetime television. By the time CBS understood what was changing, the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour had already become something they never intended. Much more than a variety show, but a front line of the battle for free speech and media responsibility. Radical guests and musical performances. As the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour gained traction, it became increasingly clear that its musical guests were not chosen solely for entertainment value. They were voices of a generation demanding change. Unlike other variety shows of the time, which largely featured apolitical or sanitized acts, Tom Smothers invited artists whose music directly addressed the political and social upheavals of the 1960s. Pete Seeger's appearance was a landmark moment. Blacklisted from network television since the McCarthy era, Seeger performed his anti-war ballad, Waist Deep in the Big Muddy, a thinly veiled criticism of President Lyndon B. Johnson and the Vietnam War. CBS initially censored the segment, but following public outcry and Tom Smothers' persistent advocacy, the network aired it, marking one of the first overtly political songs broadcast in American primetime. The show continued to use its musical stage as a forum for cultural protest. Joan Baez, a prominent anti-war and civil rights activist, used her appearances to highlight issues beyond the typical variety show fare. In one controversial moment, she dedicated a song to her then-husband, David Harris, who had been imprisoned for resisting the draft. Although the dedication was cut from the U.S. broadcast, the performance itself drew attention to the personal cost of political conviction. Acts like Jefferson Airplane brought the aesthetics of the psychedelic movement to the mainstream, performing songs that referenced substance culture and generational disillusionment. Their music, though coded, was an unmistakable call to consciousness for young viewers. Perhaps no performance epitomized the tension between rebellion and broadcast standards more than The Who's infamous appearance. Famously riotous on stage, the band ended their performance of My Generation when they smashed their instruments, shorting out CBS's sound system for the duration of the live broadcast. Although clearly part of a staged act, it represented a wider rejection of institutional norms, a metaphor appropriate for a show bent on dismantling the very conventional structures of television. Each musical performance was a cultural statement, with CBS's national platform providing the widest exposure to provoke thought, challenge authority, and voice protest movements. In the confines of CBS, the executives were becoming increasingly anxious about the musical choices of the program. What began as mild rebellion had turned into outright resistance, both lyrically and through the presence of artists themselves, many of whom had been blacklisted and banned, previously considered too controversial for network television. This left the network with no other option. As more of its affiliates in conservative markets voiced their concerns and sponsors became uncomfortable, CBS began to tighten its control over any guest bookings on the show while closely scrutinizing its musical content. Nevertheless, the Smothers Brothers and their creative team believed music would change public opinion, and that television could be more than passive entertainment. It could be an active change agent. Satire meets politics. Among the most memorable elements of the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour was comedian Pat Paulsen's recurring role as a deadpan, mock presidential candidate. Introduced during the 1968 election cycle, Paulsen's fictional campaign was designed as a parody, but it quickly became a sharp commentary on the state of American politics. Using a monotone delivery and deliberately absurd promises, Paulsen ridiculed the language of real politicians, exposing the emptiness and circular logic often found in political speeches. Lines like, "If elected, I will build more potholes to test the patience of voters," became instant classics, resonating with a generation disillusioned by political doublespeak, the Vietnam War, and governmental overreach. Paulsen's skits were deceptively simple, but their underlying critique was razor-sharp. By mimicking the rhetorical style of actual candidates, he made the flaws in their logic and the hollowness of campaign promises unmistakably clear. The character claimed to be against violence, war, and especially aggression, yet refused to offer any solutions, mirroring the political paralysis of the time. The satire reflected the broader feeling among young Americans that the political system was not only ineffective, but also fundamentally disconnected from the needs and voices of everyday citizens. His fictional campaign slogan, "I've upped my standards, now up yours," became a tongue-in-cheek motto for the politically cynical. It must also be noted that the success attached to the part was because of its accessibility. Unlike direct statements on the war or musical protests, even the satire of Paulsen was couched in terms of absurdity that enabled it to evade censorship, attracting both disenchanted youths and, indeed, conservative viewers. Many viewed it as harmless fun. This said, the campaign had a wide-ranging impact. Paulsen campaign buttons and posters were distributed on college campuses, and requests for more appearances poured in. Some fans even wrote his name in on actual ballots. Though the campaign was indeed a sham, it engendered genuine discussion about the weaknesses of the American electoral system, as well as the use of humor to illuminate awkward truths. Pat Paulsen erred in the way of a parody campaign. This gag would become one of the show's most famous recurring segments, and one of the earliest incarnations of political satire in television sketch comedy. It established the grounds for future programs such as Saturday Night Live and The Daily Show, in which parody of political figures became the cornerstone of cultural critique. Through the 1990s, Paulson continued to run satirical campaigns in real elections, reminding people that laughter is an act of resistance. The character lived on as the real meaning of that legacy. A legacy that was always with the Smothers Brothers was that, even in a tightly controlled audience of CBS, satire nonetheless muddied the calm waters and spoke straight to the angst of a nation in crisis. David Steinberg, Sermon Controversies. One of the most explosive flashpoints in the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour's history was the inclusion of David Steinberg's irreverent sermonettes, satirical monologues that parodied religious sermons while weaving in sharp political commentary. Steinberg, a rising comedian and Second City alumnus, brought a new edge to the show's already evolving tone. Beginning in late 1968, his segments mocked the sanctity of religious authority by blending biblical stories with modern-day political situations. These routines, while humorous, often targeted the intersection of religion, war, and power, making them deeply controversial, particularly in conservative regions of the country. The turning point came with Steinberg's October 1968 appearance, in which he delivered a sermon parody comparing Moses' defiance of Pharaoh to young people protesting the Vietnam War and resisting the draft. In one version of the sketch, Moses, standing in for the American conscience, looked at Pharaoh and declared, "Sorry, Mr. President, take your army and go. I will not help you any longer." The allusion to then-President Nixon was unmistakable. Several CBS affiliates, especially in the South and Midwest, refused to air the segment, deeming it blasphemous and anti-American. CBS reportedly received over 300 complaints in a single week following the broadcast, signaling a major backlash from viewers who believed the show had crossed a moral and patriotic line. CBS executives were apprehensive about the political views expressed in the show. The sermonettes created an intensification of the infighting. The word went out that if Steinberg continued to appear on the show, that would seriously threaten the network. However, Tom Smothers ignored the edict and invited Steinberg back for a 1969 segment that would be the final straw. This sketch had Steinberg in rabbi's garb, delivering another irreverent monologue from a phony pulpit directed at government and military policies using the familiar religious allegory. That episode was taped and sent to CBS censors in Hollywood on time, but the New York branch of CBS stopped it with the insistence that review deadlines had been missed. This was thought by many to be little more than a pretext for suppression. The controversy about Steinberg's segments surfaced as a microcosm of the larger issues confronting creative freedom and censorship in network television. While some saw the sermons as ghastly, others thought they were radical and necessary expressions of dissent in a time of national turmoil and generational division. Steinberg's performances conflated comedy, politics, and theology, and compelled CBS to endure questions about how far satire can go on national broadcast. Indeed, his last sermon became the episode CBS refused to air, and which ultimately led to the cancellation of the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour. The segment would go on to be aired in Canada and circulated underground through bootlegs, attaining near-mythical status. While one segment lit the fuse, what came next would expose just how far the network was willing to go to stay in control. CBS Censorship. As the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour grew bolder in its political and cultural commentary, CBS found itself increasingly at odds with the show's creative direction. Initially tolerant of Tom Smothers' gradual shift toward more pointed satire, the network became alarmed by mounting public backlash, especially from conservative affiliates and sponsors. By the second season, CBS began enforcing strict content controls, requiring that all scripts and musical performances be submitted a full 10 days before airing. This policy aimed to give network censors ample time to review, edit, or reject material deemed too controversial, a clear move to reassert corporate oversight over what had become television's most unpredictable primetime program. Tom Smothers resisted these measures from the outset, arguing that the show's relevance depended on its immediacy and authenticity. He frequently delayed the submission of scripts and taped episodes, often delivering them just before deadlines or even after, leaving CBS little time to intervene. According to internal CBS memos and later court testimony, Smothers deliberately used post-production to push the envelope, refusing to alter or remove segments that he felt were essential to the show's message. This defiance led to increasingly tense confrontations between the network's Standards and Practices Department and the show's production team. At one point, CBS executives began holding weekly meetings to review each proposed segment in detail, trying to rein in what they saw as a runaway editorial process. The tug-of-war slowly cooked, with CBS beginning to cut completed episodes or force last-minute edits against the will of the show's creators. One well-known incident was the removal from the final U.S. broadcast of a song dedication by Joan Baez to her husband, imprisoned for opposing the Vietnam War draft. That segment had been filmed with CBS's approval, and for unexplained reasons, it was left on the cutting room floor. These interventions, made on a whim, only aggravated the Smothers Brothers further, as Tom accused the network of political censorship. Although Dick Smothers had often ended up in the role of peacemaker, emphasizing the need to keep the show on the air, Tom was adamant about not compromising the integrity of the program, even at the risk of its cancellation. By early 1969, it was no longer hidden that a conflict existed between CBS and the Smothers Brothers. Affiliates in conservative regions were threatening to drop the program altogether, and sponsors were becoming increasingly wary. Although ratings on the show were high, and its audience among younger viewers was great, it had become extremely politically volatile to the network's risk-averse management. CBS chairman William Paley, once a supporter of the show's experimentalism, eventually sided with the censors. The relationship between the network and the Smothers Brothers had now become irreparably damaged, and what began as a stage for intelligent comedy became a battlefield over free speech, editorial independence, and the boundaries of televised dissent. The Forbidden Episode. The most pivotal moment in the history of the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour came with the production of its unaired April 1969 episode, now infamously known as The Forbidden Episode. This particular broadcast featured comedian David Steinberg delivering a sharply satirical sermon that likened Moses to a modern anti-war activist, ending with the biting line, "Sorry, Mr. President, take your army and go." This was interpreted as a direct challenge to President Nixon and the U.S. government's role in the Vietnam War. Tom Smothers had been explicitly warned by CBS that Steinberg's return could result in severe consequences, but he made a conscious decision to proceed, underscoring the show's growing commitment to challenging authority through comedy. Production of the episode followed the required procedures, at least according to the show's team. It was sent to CBS's Hollywood censors on schedule, but the network's New York office later claimed it had missed the review deadline. This discrepancy became the flashpoint for a long, simmering conflict between the show's creative staff and the CBS hierarchy. Internal documents and later court revelations suggest that CBS used the missed deadline claim as a pretext to block the episode entirely, fearful of further alienating conservative affiliates and advertisers amid growing political pressure. At the heart of the issue was not timing, but content. The sermon had pushed beyond what the network was willing to tolerate during a tense political climate. On April 4, 1969, CBS canceled the show without justification to the public. There was not even an official goodbye or a press meeting, just a sudden replacement of the time slot with hee-haw, which indicated their intent to avoid manifest controversy. While the censored episode was never shown in the US, in a rapid sequence of events, it was broadcasted by Canada's CTV and went on to gain underground cult status. Bootleg copies made their rounds through students and activists, all but solidifying the legend of the unaired episode. For many, it stood as a mark of the show's extreme creative risk-taking and the reality of institutional suppression on American television. The disaster of this one episode went far beyond a canceled show. It redefined the boundaries of political speech in the mainstream media. It became a symbol of resistance, not merely for what was aired, but for the very principles behind the decision to air it. Tom Smothers chose to preserve the episode instead of altering it to appease CBS. In effect, he sacrificed the show in defense of a larger principle. The episode's banishment was the moment that freedom of artistic expression, the politics of the networks, and governmental sensitivities collided and left a deep gash in the American media landscape. Legal aftermath and industry blacklisting. After the show's sudden cancellation, Tom and Dick Smothers took their battle off screen, filing a lawsuit against CBS for breach of contract and wrongful termination. The legal dispute centered on whether CBS had valid grounds to cancel the show based on missed production deadlines. The Smothers Brothers contended that CBS's real motivation was to silence political content that had become too controversial, particularly the final episode with David Steinberg. Over the next 4 years, the courtroom became a new stage, this time for debating the boundaries of creative control and political interference in network television. The 1973 court ruling sided with the Smothers Brothers, awarding them $776,300 in damages and validating their claim that the cancellation was unjustified. However, the legal victory did little to restore their place in the television industry. By the time the judgment was handed down, the damage to their careers was irreversible. CBS, while penalized financially, had already moved on. The verdict acknowledged that the brothers had been wronged, but it couldn't reopen the doors that had quietly closed across the industry. In the eyes of other networks, the brothers were no longer just comedians, they were liabilities. They were then consigned to an almost near period of being professionally isolated. Although the Smothers continued to perform in smaller venues and on the college circuit, they became blacklisted from anything that went out live nationally. Tom, who had actively confronted CBS and had been their voice, was the most affected. Dick, for the most part, was seen as mildly tainted by the spillover from Tom's rhetoric. Work dried up. Producers began avoiding them in fear of political controversy or corporate backlash. They had literally won the case in court, but their trust was gone in the eyes of the entertainment industry gatekeepers. The blacklisting extended a chill far beyond the Smothers Brothers. It stood as a loud warning to other creatives. Even when you're right, confronting a network could slay your career. Theirs was a lesson as to how fragile free expression is in the world of commercial media, where corporate risk management often trumps artistic merit. Only decades later, with the surge in political comedy on cable and streaming, would their legacy come to undergo a re-evaluation and acknowledgement. While their court win solidified their rights, the industry's long memory had kept the penalties for exercising those rights heavy back then and lasting into the unforgiving present. The enduring power of the Smothers Brothers. The legacy of the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour has only grown more significant with time, evolving from a short-lived variety show into a cornerstone of political satire and media history. Despite its premature cancellation in 1969, the show proved that comedy could be more than entertainment. It could be cultural resistance. Through a blend of sketch comedy, folk music, and biting satire, Tom and Dick Smothers redefined what network television could be during a time of war, protest, and generational upheaval. Their boldness inspired an entire lineage of comedians and writers to speak truth to power, setting the stage for shows like Saturday Night Live, The Daily Show, and Last Week Tonight, all of which echoed the Smothers' fearless integration of humor and critique. That influence is not just historical. It has been reignited in the digital era. Many of the once censored clips and controversial sketches have resurfaced online, reaching younger audiences who recognize the show's relevance in today's climate of political polarization and media scrutiny. Platforms like YouTube and TikTok have breathed new life into iconic moments, from Pat Paulson's mock campaign to Tom's cutting one-liners. Viral memes and remixed audio clips have turned "Mom always liked you best" into more than a catchphrase. It's a cultural callback to one of TV's most daring and disruptive acts. What was once passed around on bootleg VHS tapes is now being shared globally, reframed for new conversations about free speech, media control, and satire. A major contributor to this resurgence has been the preservation and academic respect for the show's archive. In 2022, the University of California, Santa Barbara acquired and began digitizing a monumental trove of material related to the Smothers Brothers, including unaired episodes, production notes, and correspondence from within CBS. The collection provides scholars with an unparalleled view of the internal conflicts between creative freedom and institutional censorship. Media studies courses now use the Smothers Brothers as examples of activism and backlash, while exhibitions and conferences feature the once censored material as proof of comedy's role in political resistance. These activities not only sustain the legacy, but also place it in a context for new generations of creators and thinkers. And just as the world begins to look back, life has moved the story forward in unexpected ways. A new chapter. More than 50 years after the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour pushed the boundaries of political satire on television, the legacy of the groundbreaking duo continues to live on, albeit now with only one surviving brother. Dick Smothers, now 86, remains active and engaged with fans. Although he and Tom officially retired from touring in 2010, Dick made headlines in 2022 when he married Marie Navaroli Kropp, and again in 2023 when he announced a reunion tour with Tom. Unfortunately, those plans were canceled after Tom was diagnosed with stage 2 lung cancer. Still, Dick has participated in charity events and continues to honor their shared history with grace and humor. Tom Smothers, affectionately known as Tommy, passed away on December 26, 2023, at age 86. Known for his fearless stance on political issues and creative integrity, Tom had become an icon of artistic resistance. Even beyond the television studio, he embodied the rebellious spirit that defined the show. In later years, he focused more on personal passions, including operating Remick Ridge Vineyards in Sonoma, California, which he co-owned with Dick. His death marked the end of an era, prompting tributes from fans and fellow comedians alike, who recognized his trailblazing contributions to free speech in media. Other cast members of the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour have also remained in the entertainment field. Now 83, Peter Cullen began as an announcer on the show. He was to become one of the best-known voices in animation, most notably as Optimus Prime in the Transformers franchise. He recently reprised this role in a segment on The Masked Singer. Lee French once appeared on the show as a recurring character under the moniker Goldie O'Keefe, but has retired from acting in most other respects, leaving a legacy of inspiration for female comedians. Virginia Ann Lee was another regular on the show and went on to appear in different series like MASH, although she has retreated from the public eye recently. As the legacy of the Smothers Brothers is rediscovered by younger audiences via social media and streaming platforms, Dick's ongoing presence continues to help bridge the generation gap. Voiceover legends to endearing comedy sketches, the alumni of this show have shaped the entertainment landscape quietly but indelibly. Well, Tom may no longer be around, but certainly the bold comedic voice of his time still resounds through today's more politically inclined television. And with Dick Smothers still going strong, the story of the Smothers Brothers isn't quite done yet. Thanks for watching. If you found this story as fascinating as we did, don't forget to like the video, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more untold moments from TV history. And don't go anywhere. Check out the next video on your screen for another surprising story that changed entertainment forever.